Hey guys and gals, it's Tripl-L, and now let's talk about a Zelda Breath of the Wild related thing, something that popped up over the last few days, and it's ultimately having to do with the topic of review scores. So very quickly to tell you the story that kind of spurred on this video, here's what happened. A reviewer by the name of Jim Sterling, some of you may know him, he's relatively famous on YouTube. He did a review for Breath of the Wild, and it was not a 10. The review wasn't 10 out of 10, it was 7 out of 10, which by all means is still a good game. It even says it at the bottom of his review. Anyway, that review went up and then some things happened on the internet made its move and people reacted, Zelda fans reacted in a way that is questionable. What ended up happening is that people complained, people were outraged. Then DDoS attacks happened on his site, it went down, and now we've just been kind of stuck in that saga. And it's all coming off of that 7 out of 10, with some of the most extreme examples of that behavior and the reasoning for why people are so mad being a giant thing about trying to bring down Zelda's Metacritic score, just being someone that was saying things just to cause controversy within the community. You know, a lot of reasonings going in to why that 7 out of 10 happened and why people should be justified in spewing hate towards that review for the 7 out of 10. Now, I will put the review itself up in the description of the video. Check that out if you want. Give it a read if you want. The site might not load. It was struggling when I first went in to try and find the review to read it. It should be up now, but it's still pretty slow. You might have to give it a few attempts if you actually want to connect through. I don't know how well it's doing today. So now it doesn't really matter what the narrative is, what actually really happened, because the way that most sites are reporting on the story, that is the way that most people are going to be interpreting this particular story. So in this video, it's pretty much going to just turn into a bit of a discussion video about the implications of that 7 out of 10, and also just an opportunity to talk about the 10 out of 10s for Zelda Breath of the Wild and what the 10 out of 10 actually means versus what it should mean. And this is a topic I've been wanting to talk about because I've been playing the game. I've logged 30 hours and I have a developed opinion about it, and I have an opinion about all the 10 out of 10s that the game was receiving and what ultimately I think may be going on and how people are interpreting that 10 out of 10. Let's keep it short and sweet. Getting into an outrage and raging about the score of a video game and applying your own logic as to why you're justified in raging about that particular score or that review, you know, that's a little bit extreme. That's a bit too much, especially when the score itself and the review that accompanies it is very well thought out. Now, it doesn't really matter what you think this guy's agenda was. It doesn't really matter what you think his line of thought was in creating that review or creating that score. You know, it doesn't matter if you think that he was looking for things to dislike in the game. Fact of the matter is, someone put their opinion out there. That opinion was influential enough, and then people got really offended at that opinion because it was influential enough. At least people who were looking at it from the Metacritic angle. Again, I don't know how big that population is, but the way people are reporting about it makes it seem like it's a giant population. Regardless, it's big enough that someone went and made the attacks on the site that the review was hosted on. So overall, we have an opinion causing a big amount of outrage. But how justified is that opinion? Well, here's the thing. The Zelda Breath of the Wild, it got 10 out of 10s. It was a really big deal. Everyone's giving it 10 out of 10s. But really, what does that 10 out of 10 mean? Because if you sit down and you play that game, you know, that 10 out of 10 becomes kind of hard to justify unless you realize what standard most people are holding that game to. Because when you sit down and you play the game, and this was also referenced in the review in question, and some of the gripes that reviewer had, Jim Sterling had, Game Explain over here on YouTube also had similar gripes in some areas. And that's really important too, because when you consider it, Game Explain gave the game a review on their skill that they really liked it, but that was not I loved it. You know, they have their skill going from, you know, just bad to I loved it, but they went for I really like it. You know, that was a step down for the game, and it ultimately does talk about what's going on here. So if you look at the technicality of the game, if you look at the design, these are areas where most reviews will mention, and they will talk about to some degree. The review in question, the 7 out of 10, also talked about them. So in terms of design, when you look at the game, if you look at the inventory system, it's a very easy argument to say this isn't that well optimized. Like, the inventory system is just kind of put together, and it's true. It's kind of cumbersome to go into the inventory system and the various things that you have to deal with. For instance, you initially start off with a shortened inventory system. You can upgrade it, but that's going to take a while. By that time, you're going to have gone into that inventory system to dump a weapon to be able to pick up a new weapon in a chest multiple times. That's a flaw in game design, and you could argue such because it is cumbersome and it takes away from the experience. This was one of the things that were highlighted in the Game Explain review and was also highlighted in the review in question. Then there were other issues, like the fact Zelda Breath of the Wild does not perform well on the consoles it's released on. The game dips in frame rate very often, from the Wii U version to the Switch version. And for the Wii U version, it's a little bit worse because it's a bit of a weaker system, but the Wii U version also doesn't have any kind of gamepad implementation while the game's running on the TV. That's pretty much saying that Breath of the Wild was just too much of a game that the Wii U couldn't handle it, and to some degree the Switch can't handle it either. Not to mention the fact that the games are likely to freeze up in certain moments. And the thing is, you will run into a lot of sequences where you have a lot of enemies coming at you, but there are some sequences where you will have the same amount of enemies and you will have freezes, like a 6-second freeze or a 4-second freeze happening back to back. Now, when you consider the technicality of the game, that doesn't really land to a 10 out of 10 just by the bare design and technicality, because it's talking about cumbersome systems that ultimately just hamper the experience. When you think 10 out of 10, you wouldn't think a game that's likely to freeze and a game that's guaranteed to always almost be in stuttering frames. Now, other things that were pointed out in the review in question were the systems like the dynamic weather system and the weapon durability system. And now this is where things get a lot more divisive and where the idea of this is an opinion really comes into play, because the weapon durability system is either you love it or you hate it. You know, I personally enjoy it because it gives me that sense of, oh yeah, great, my weapon's just broken. This is a pretty tense situation. You know, for me, it just makes the situation a lot more tense because it's like, wow, I'm out of weapons and now I need to deal with this. But at the same time, for other people, it could just be seen as something cumbersome, especially with how easy some weapons are to break. And because of the weapon durability system, you get this interesting little effect. Like for me, for instance, I have a fire blade and a thunder blade. I am not going to use those bad boys at all because they're the only ones I have and I don't want to break them. You know, the weapon durability system gives a lot more value to your weapons, but that also puts you in a position where you might not want to be giving or not be willing to give up those weapons. So then when it comes to those aspects of just the design of the game, like the weather impairing you from climbing anywhere, or the weapons just being so flimsy you might not want to use the really good weapons, it ultimately just makes for something where it really depends on the preference of a person and dependent on how much games they have under their belt. Now, the review itself was really well defined and it was really well thought out. It gave its reasons, and ultimately giving it a 7 out of 10 and a good is justifiable along with the reasons that they pointed out in the review. But now when you go and look at the other 10 out of 10 reviews, you will realize that these people also made allowances for the game's various shortcomings, the things like the render distance not being that great, or the things like the frame rate drops or the freezing. They made allowances for that, and also the inventory system. They made allowances for that, but that's because that 10 out of 10 at the end of the day isn't really speaking of the technicality of the game, even though it should be. The 10 out of 10 is more speaking of how much a person will enjoy this game. And for a lot of those 10 out of 10 reviewers, they're having a blast with the game because they're holding it up to a standard that was set by the Zelda series and by Nintendo at large. They're playing by the standard based on Zelda's formula. And when you base it on that standard, Breath of the Wild is like a breath of fresh air. And that new effect might go a long way into biasing some of the reviews towards the really positive. What you end up having here is that a lot of people might be just taken in by what Breath of the Wild sets out to do. The things that Breath of the Wild wants to do, it does really, really well. And for the people who chose to give the 10 out of 10 reviews, it ultimately just comes to the fact that what it does is so enjoyable that it's okay to overlook the inherent flaws in the design of the system. Because Breath of the Wild isn't a game about managing your inventory. It's not a game about being able to see little details as opposed to the big landmarks. But those things ultimately, depending on the reviewer, will add up, and whether or not the reviewer decides to have it take away from the final score or just have it be ignored in spite of a better game, you know, it's ultimately the reviewer's preference. That said, to call Zelda Breath of the Wild the perfect game is factually incorrect by the very virtue that it has freezes that could last upwards of 10 seconds, and by the very virtue that majority of the times when you're going into a vibrant area, it is stuttering a little bit in the frame rate. You know, it just technically doesn't perform that well in certain key areas. But it's still a very enjoyable game. And even going back to the review in question, it's 7 out of 10, Jim Sterling spoke of one of his encounters that he very much enjoyed going to the Goron City, just running through, catching fire, but he liked being able to do it the hard way, that he didn't have to drink an elixir potion to give himself some extra minutes of fire resistance, that he just kind of tanked it through, and that was enjoyable. And that's what Breath of the Wild does. It gives you the freedom to solve your problems in different ways, and when it's doing that, it's a really great game. But again, it doesn't take away that this is not a perfect game. So look, if you were someone that was offended by the notion that someone might not like Breath of the Wild as much as you, you know, I don't want to speak down to you, and I won't. It's okay to feel offended. It's okay to feel bad about it. I mean, at the end of the day, this might be a game that you really love, and you love it so much that it feels wrong when some people talk it down, especially when on the internet, some people are very colorful with their language and just spew. It's pretty much the equivalent of verbal diarrhea, and it's just like, there's no need to talk that harshly or that idiotically about something that they might not very well know that much about. And yeah, I get it, that could offend you and that could bother you, and as a fan it might hurt you on a deeper level, but at the same time, there's a limit to rational behavior. There's no need to go out of your way to punish someone for having an opinion, despite what they might think going in spite of what you might think if they have an agenda. As long as you only believe that they have an agenda, you don't have the concrete proof, you know, to act on that kind of rationale is a bit trigger happy, and it might just cause more problems than it needs to cause. That said, that's my thoughts on the matter. Let me know what you thought down below. Let me know how much you love Breath of the Wild. Let me know how you feel about the 10 out of 10 reviews, whether you think they're justified. On what scale do you think they're justified? Do you think the 10 out of 10s are speaking more about the enjoyment that you're going to get from this game, or the actual technicality in the design of the game? And also, like, talk about what things in Breath of the Wild you didn't like and what things you did like. It's okay to not like certain aspects of a game. There's nothing wrong with that. But anyway guys, thanks for watching. Let's end it there. Until next time, I hope you have a great day.